The Industrial Revolution eventually changed the world.
Exactly because of industrialization, we now have much more material comfort, people live longer, they can do things that even kings in the pre-industrial age could not dream of.
With the fourth revolution, we call it Industry 4.0. I always compare it a little bit like with the human body. You know, we see with our eyes, we act with our hands, and we process with our brains. The machinery and automation recently has more like been our hands. And now, with the fourth industrial revolution, we have a chance to basically make those elements really intelligent, similar to like our body.
People are going to be able to have both the knowledge and the tools available to make things that can make a difference in their lives. It's something that's happening across the globe. It's not just in the industrialized countries. More and more we're seeing it in poorer countries.
C'est bien de tout automatiser, mais si c'est pour mettre tout le monde au chômage, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire, quoi?
Where I live, it's quite sad because we have a big old factory there and it's being knocked down quite soon. And that's kind of sad. And I guess Britain's kind of known for being industrial, so...
In all transformations, there is always fear. There has been fear in the first revolution, in the second revolution, and there is a lot of fear today.
Manufacturamos a un ritmo que no podemos, el planeta no se lo puede permitir.
There are things to be learned from all countries. The emphasis on sustainability, on environmental concerns, on quality of life for workers
is a really very exciting development in the world right now. But there are certain threats that it comes with. And one of them is that countries like ours in poorer parts of the world will actually be left behind. And the reason that they would be left behind, if that were to happen, would be because we wouldn't have a population that's able to keep up.
What I think could be done to make people stay in Africa is us having more factories that can do manufacturing.
I don't think the threat of being left behind is bigger than the opportunity that's being introduced by Industry 4.0 right now.
Today we commit ourselves to new sustainable development goals, including our goal of ending extreme poverty in our world. After all, it is a lack of development when people have no education and no jobs and no hope, a feeling that their basic human dignity is being violated, that helps fuel so much of the tensions and conflict and instability in our world. Supporting development is not charity, but is instead one of the smartest investments we can make in our own future.
The first industrial revolution was probably one of the biggest changes in economic and social terms ever to have hit the planet.
You have to go back to the 18th century in England when the steam machine was invented. With that invention, England started doing a production process that immediately reflected an increase in productivity on average of 50% vis-a-vis other countries at the same time.
Having more material output literally is a matter of life and death. People eat more, they can heat their houses better, they can visit the doctor once more, children live longer, old people survive another winter.
It also changed the way people lived, and particularly in England you saw a big shift from a society that was based on agriculture into one that became industrialized.
It did raise incomes, of course, but it also led to some social problems. Some of the people working in those factories discovered the factories were not very nice places.
They start working when they're like 11, by that 21 they have serious lung diseases, they die out. But then there are millions more workers who could be replacements.
It took us more than 100 years after that, in the middle of the 19th century and early in the 20th century, when the invention of electricity really pushed us to mass production.
As the red-hot steel shoots through the guides, Jim sees in the glow the part it will play in building America.
By the second industrial revolution, this led to even bigger scale of production involving production line. Factories are becoming bigger and you are always kind of working in synchronization with your colleagues, and then that created a fertile environment for trade unionism. Workers began to be organized, they demanded votes, they demanded welfare.
As the idea of the factory grew, you needed a more sophisticated labor to operate these machines, to build these machines, and to develop new machines and new products which could be built by the factory. And that all meant you needed better educated people.
These boys have accepted the change, and many of them have thrilled to the power of accomplishment. While a lot of the old traits are still strong, kindly and patient instruction, day after day, is doing its work. It's surprising how these Russian children have adapted themselves to the routine of classes.
Technological revolutions, industrial revolutions, first of all, change our material existence, but that spills into the whole way the society is organized. So that these are, the true revolutions.
El desarrollo textil en Cataluña aparece en la Primera Guerra Mundial, en el 1914. España, como no estaba involucrada en la guerra, empezó a fabricar productos textiles para el ejército de las diferentes naciones que estaban combatiendo en la Primera Guerra Mundial. El textil nace porque la gente abandona el campo y lo que hace es empezar a realizar productos textiles en casa, porque es fácil conectar una máquina a la red eléctrica y a partir de aquí es cuando empiezan a aparecer las primeras industrias y hacen un proceso ya más manufacturado en vez de una producción más avanzada. Por eso la industria textil es de las primeras en instalarse en los diferentes países emergentes.
Al surgir y expandirse las empresas industriales, pues fue un gran valor para las mujeres para poder trabajar fuera de su casa. E incluso eso les dio pues alas a fortalecerse y pedir y reclamar el voto.
After World War II, it was an incredible economic and social mess. Much of the continent completely devastated, the economies completely bombed out. Manufacturing enabled much of Europe to gradually rebuild, and it was gradually able to increase employment, wealth, in a way that made a lot of parts of Europe really very prosperous during the 50s, 60s and 70s.
The most important innovations after the Second World War were the electrical and electronics revolutions. Invention of all these household appliances which became generalized since the 1960s. You know?
Further research indicates a whole array of things which can be made better than ever before. But to know for sure that these are things that women really want requires the stamp of approval from our partners in research, the women themselves.
The washing machine has changed the world more than the internet has, liberating women from household work to an extent, allowing them to move into the labor market, which changed the whole family dynamic, whole demographics, you know, whole issues of gender equality and so on. But the third industrial revolution really transformed the way we live even further.
You had the flowering, I suppose, of technology development. You had more and more people interested in the way science and technology worked. You had a lot of new ideas, let's talk about plastics processing or electronics, that enabled some of those new products to come onto the market. You had the beginnings of consumer style behaviour of the sort you see today. You had the early days of televisions, radios, and of course even computers as time went on, all of which were the product of innovative ideas coming out of the educational institutes and more from some of the companies. Governments were very involved in pushing a lot of that technology development.
UNIDO is an industrial engineering group that is involved in many different industrial sectors. 100 years ago, FIV was producing steel parts and constructing steel realizations. For instance, steel was responsible for the construction of the elevators of the Eiffel Tower. What is very interesting to see is how digital technologies have also progressively been introduced in this quite traditional industry. We started with the third revolution, of course, with the connection of the different heating and cooling devices in the steel line process. And progressively, hundreds of sensors were introduced all along the line to make sure that the quality of the steel produced was monitored throughout the whole production process. And thus this gave rise to the capacity for our industry to produce high-quality steel, such as the one required for automotive, for instance.
Manufacturing up to, I would say, the present point in time has been a mass manufacturing business. The economy has always said the more things you made, the cheaper you can make them. Now, where Asia came in was very seeing that if you could provide cheaper wage costs, then you could attract that production offshore. And so we saw a huge shift in manufacturing certain goods and products from domestic markets in Europe and in America to be made overseas.
Yo empecé a trabajar en esta empresa cuando tenía 15 años como administrativo y estuve durante 30 años. De los años 70 a los años 85 la plantilla se incrementó aproximadamente hasta los 1.200.
Y a poco pues se fue despidiendo gente, hasta que lo cerraron.
La entrada de producto textil de países del este, fuera de Europa, provocó una competencia en el precio que originó una debacle total. Bueno, la evolución del mundo hace que las cosas no duran toda la vida si no sabes reconducirlas a otros sectores o a otras actividades, ¿no?
Japan was the first country that was able to manufacture goods at a very low cost in the 60s to early 70s. After that, it was Hong Kong and Taiwan, and China started to pick up this business probably in the 1980s.
Asia became a more receptive place for companies to go and invest, not only because they had these large populations, it also had governments who saw the point of all this.
So they didn't just make things to provide their own needs, but they actually became an export base from the word go.
For example, China is famous for having entire cities that are devoted to making a single product. For example, in one city in Zhejiang province, there will be hundreds of factories that are making only buttons. So if you are Walmart or Liz Claiborne or whoever, you want the place where you can get your goods made cheaply, but you also want the place where you can get something specific, very fast, very flexibly, very cheaply.
Like an African country, when I was born, life expectancy in Korea was 52. Now I'm 53, so in all probability I should be dead, but I'm not. Today the life expectancy in Korea is like 82 years at the European level. And all of this has been possible because the country used a judicious mixture of market forces and government intervention. The conventional wisdom has it that you have to have free trade, free market in order to develop the economy. But this is very misleading because when you look at the development experience of all the rich countries today, starting from 18th century Britain down to 19th century US and Germany and 20th century Japan, Korea and Taiwan, all of these countries at the beginning of the economic development used a lot of government intervention.
二代创业初期的时候，是一个开不出工资、靠借钱发工资的企业。那我自己还是贫困的，所以我们自己走了一个脱贫之路。我觉得这个非常重要，就是说你企业自己有没有一个精神，我一定要脱贫，而且从脱贫走向反。
Hundreds of millions of people over the past 20 years are leaving rural China, moving into the cities, and eventually many of them are becoming the middle class. If you go in as a journalist and you see them for one afternoon, you might think, oh, these poor workers, they look so poor, they look so young, they look so desperate. But, go visit that worker in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, and you'll find that many of these people have settled down in the city, they've gotten married, and they've become city people, and their kids are living completely different lives than they have.
The Latin American countries had achieved quite considerable industrialization between the 1930s and 1970s. After that, they have experienced a process known as deindustrialization. They lost a huge amount of their industries. And more recently, the commodity boom coming from super growth in China tempted these countries to just ignore industries that are more tricky to manage and just go back to primary commodities, because if you can produce that good soya beans, the sky was the limit.
In the 80s, our exports were composed basically of oil and minerals. 65% of our exports were primary products, and only about 34% or 33% were manufacturing. Today, 90% manufacturing and only 7% oil and minerals. And that has changed drastically the economic geography of Mexico. Sectors that are highly developed, but we have it on the south, a very specific sector has not been linked to this modernization process.
A lot of developing countries are stuck with raw materials. Yeah? So they produce coffee, but Italians sell the most expensive coffee because they have the best technology to roast the coffee, make the coffee machine.
The fact is that when you do that, you export a lot of high quality goods outside of the continent, and we're left with really no value add or hardly any value add to our resources, whether they be mineral or agricultural or whatever it is.
The main reason why many people tend to migrate to the West is that there lies very lucrative opportunities overseas.
In the African case, even in the earlier period, industrialization was rather meager because they were at a much lower level of development, but especially after having opened up their economies under pressure from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank since the 1980s, these countries just didn't have the space to grow their infant industries.
The major obstacles are the infrastructure is a big one. So just getting around, being able to transport goods and services, we haven't had an investment in infrastructure historically. The quality and the pervasiveness of good education is a limitation. It's very limited in Africa. Another barrier is the cost of energy and availability of energy on the continent. We also have barriers that are related to governance. Very often you'll get the wrong kind of leader in power, people who are corrupt and corruptible. People who might want to come and invest in parts of the continent might be put off because of corruption. Manufacturing requires heavy investment and it requires a lot of knowledge and experience. And so in Africa, you have a large population that really hasn't gone through the green revolution, let alone the industrial revolution, which means that people, in terms of their capacity to buy things and so on, hasn't really been there in a manner that will allow manufacturing to be invested in on the continent as it was in Asia.
The gap between the rich and the poor, will it get bigger? Will it reduce? What we're seeing now is the old economies of post-industrial revolution, of mass manufacturing and economies of scale beginning to change because new manufacturing techniques, new materials, the digital world, the old rules no longer apply. New things are happening, new ideas are emerging. And that's a difficult thing to get a grasp of, and to be honest, not all the answers are known.
With the fourth revolution, we call it Industry 4.0, we bring together all the good things that machinery automation have brought to us. Machines have become more robust, more performing, and we're now bringing that together with all the intelligence that is in data, is in sensors, that is in basically machine intelligence. We have new technologies, design, we're talking about a digital twin, so while designing a product, we already have an image of the actual product. We have an opportunity to basically build products right from scratch, similar to what you know from 3D printing and polymers is now possible in metals also. So I think those elements and those technology and combining them will indeed transform a couple of very work-intensive but also very logistic-intensive industry.
The evolution of 3D printing also enables to create new production facilities in a far smaller scale, but dedicated to a given production, and again, placing production sites in areas within cities, for instance, in countries in which it was not possible to do it before, because you have this proximity to your customer, to your workers, but also to the whole city and urban network. Revolution 4.0 currently gives rise to a whole new field for robotics, and this is collaborative robotics, cobots. A cobot is a robot that is able to work with the man, assisting him in his everyday tasks, even in some cases, giving him the force to improve his gesture.
We often get the question, what about human labor? And with all those beautiful machines, are we just standing there around, sitting and watching while those beautiful pieces are taking over our jobs? And the simple answer to that question is yes, there's a fair amount of jobs that will not be needed anymore in the future. So if you're basically just driving around with a forklift stuff in a factory from A to B, there's little optimization or intelligence behind that. I think autonomous robots, hauling systems can do that better in the future. But that's only one part of the story. The second part of the story basically has to deal with all the new business models that are dealing with the value of information, talk about predictive maintenance, talk about remote condition monitoring, pay-per-usage models. We will need people to design those products. We will need people to build those products, to sell them and to operate them.
Overall, we can see that countries that have heavily invested in robots, such as Germany, such as Italy, have been able to maintain a high level of employment and a high level of industrial activity on their soil.
It is those economies that have a higher share of manufacturing, ideally combined with consumption in that economy, that leads to sustainable development and hence to the reduction of poverty. Now, the textile industry is an interesting example with regards to the changes that new technology can bring to an industrial logic. In textiles, people were, for the past 2 decades, always on the hunt for the cheapest job. Who could produce a t-shirt for $3 rather than $4? They went to places like China, Myanmar, Burma, Vietnam, and so on. Now something is changing in that industry. We have the opportunity to produce fast textiles, intelligent textiles, maybe with sensors integrated in that, and that enables us to dramatically shorten lead times for production.
El futuro textil que nosotros vamos a tener aquí en nuestra zona, tenemos que tener productos de alto valor añadido. Aquí tenemos un ejemplo de una camiseta para el sector médico, en el cual tenemos un sensor, aquí podemos ver que tiene una forma sinusoidal, que lo que hace nos mide la capacidad respiratoria de una persona. Entonces tenemos un caso en el cual a través de una fibra de papel hacemos el desarrollo, el diseño y la fabricación de un prototipo de lo que podría ser una estructura para embalaje. Alto valor, primero, que son ecológicos y respetan el medio ambiente, y segundo, que le dan valor añadido al contenido del producto cuando nos lo vamos a comprar.
Sustainability goals are going to become harder to reach because we have new manufacturing techniques, we have new materials, we have new ideas. How do you recycle carbon fibre? You know, when the latest generation of aircraft come to the end of their lives, what is going to happen to them? Some of these technologies are very exotic. Some of the products are coming out really only the wealthy can afford. You know, electric cars are great things. Yes, they're quite green and they're attractive, but who's going to pay for them? On the other hand, though, some of these manufacturing technologies will reduce costs. LED lighting, for instance, has brought lighting to countries and places that didn't have electricity grids. So suddenly small rural villages have light. That means children can study in the evening in houses instead of using smoky gas lamps, so that's better for their health.
About 50 to 75% of material inputs in industrial economies are thrown away as waste within a year. We simply cannot continue to grow the economy without decoupling our economic growth from materials use.
第一个呢，就是说，怎么样避免走那个牺牲环境以求发展，然后呢，再是先污染后治理，就是这么一条道路。
What needs to happen now is that countries need to realize what's going on and how they can fit in this changing world. And that's a difficult thing to get a grasp of. And to be honest, not all the answers are known. There needs to be somewhere you can turn to, some body you can talk to and see where they can fit into this changing world of production.
That the Assembly wishes to adopt draft resolution A/70/L1. It is so decided.
The Sustainable Development Goals is a step forward from the Millennium Development Goals, which basically, despite the name development, focused on removing extreme poverty and fulfilling people's basic needs. With this Sustainable Development Goals, now we are beginning to pay attention to industrialization. And I think UNIDO has an important role to play in this because, as I keep emphasizing, manufacturing has to play a key role in economic development, even in the rich countries where manufacturing doesn't look that important. It's still the engine of the economy. And UNIDO, as an international organization that is dedicated to developing industry or manufacturing industry, having matured into an organization of 50 years of age, becomes a key player in the pursuit of Sustainable Development Goals.
UNIDO was one of the first UN entities to engage with the private sector, and by supporting developing countries to benefit from the next industrial revolution, UNIDO is helping drive the transformation the world needs.
A body like UNIDO, which is a global organisation, I think it's got a vital role for spreading the word about what is going on in manufacturing, and indeed telling people about this is the new world of industry, having a potentially very powerful impact on economic growth.
The impact in Africa could be enormous. Along the same lines as the impact the Industrial Revolution had in Europe a couple of centuries ago, and in Asia later than that. And we're seeing now that there's a real uptake in technology in Africa. People are forsaking some of the stuff that they'd normally buy, like soda and stuff like that, so that they can have connectivity and be able to make calls. People are accessing information as never before, and it's structured in ways that they can consume it and be able to get some kind of qualification that makes sense to their lives. And these changes mean that in the future we'll have a much better educated workforce. Fab Labs are out of MIT. It's an idea of a professor there who taught a course called How to Make Almost Anything, and found out very quickly this course can actually be applied anywhere in the world. So long as you have a certain collection of equipment, which include 3D printers and laser cutters and things like those, and then you're taught a wide range of classes on how best to use these machines. So Gearbox is a step above that in the sense that Gearbox provides more equipment and more training for people to be actually able to make the things that they need to make, to prototype them en route to manufacture. Because if you're looking for investment but you haven't got a prototype, then you have a problem. But if you're able to make a prototype and maybe even do a pilot and test it out there in the market, then your ability to convince an investor to invest in your idea is much better. So that's really what Gearbox is doing, to try and bring Industry 4.0 to Kenya and even beyond. Having collaboration between the makers and the engineers and the academic institutions and all the other players is a very important part of creating an ecosystem that really becomes a production line for high-tech companies, if you like.
You try to put on a pedestal some of the successful entrepreneurs, and you try to create as much possible employment from the new forms of manufacturing as you could, and then you've got a chance. And if countries organise themselves properly in the way they use these ideas, the gaps between the haves and the have-nots will shrink.
Innovation cycles are becoming so fast that maybe the education you get from school, from university, is good enough for the first 4 to 5 years into your new job.
Increasingly people are realizing that successful wealth creation in the modern world is a collective project that has to involve the workers, the managers, the government, the education institutions, the research institutes, and the challenge